The WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment. There have been countless criticisms about them over the years, but nobody can deny their impact on professional wrestling. They essentially transformed it into what we know it is today, and remain the biggest promotion out there. But despite maintaining such dominance over the sport, they have been through some tough times. The WWE has gone through some major ups and downs over the years. I'm talking about on the creative end, on the financial end, their reputation. I mean, this is a crazy story. So for today, I want to try to tie it all together as I highlight the multiple eras and the corresponding rises and falls of the WWE. And of course, the main person behind most of this is Vince McMahon, maybe one of the most polarizing figures out there, but he has been the person behind the WWE. He is the third generation of the McMahon family to be involved in professional wrestling, but easily the one who has made the biggest impact on it. I mean, almost anything that characterizes wrestling today, he was the one who either developed it or popularized it. His father owned a promotion that would feature matches in the northeastern part of the United States, mainly in New York City and Philadelphia. Well, in 1982, when his father was sick, Vince bought the business from him, at the time called the WWF, and quickly made some major changes that led to its initial rise in what has been commonly referred to as the Golden Age. On the back end, he expanded their reach by acquiring smaller regional promotions and by paying local TV stations to air their matches. But the revolutionary part of it was his decision to embrace the entertainment aspect of it, turning the events into spectacles, featuring big personalities acting out scripted storylines, celebrity guests, even admitting to having predetermined outcomes for entertainment purposes to avoid regulations that applied to more traditional sports. Maybe the perfect example of all of it was the first ever WrestleMania in 1985. The main event featured Mr. T wrestling alongside Hulk Hogan, who had both gained popularity for their roles in Rocky III, and by the way, co-hosted Saturday Night Live together as an effort to promote the big event the day before it happened. There were celebrity guests involved like Cyndi Lauper and Muhammad Ali. It was a crazy show that was successful enough to be followed by over 30 more WrestleManias and hundreds of other pay-per-view events. Maybe the absolute peak of the Golden Age was WrestleMania 3, where over 93,000 people in the Pontiac Silverdome watched Hulk Hogan win the championship against Andre the Giant. Professional wrestling and the WWF became a phenomenon, with the biggest wrestlers of the time becoming household names. However, the popularity quickly began to fall entering the 1990s with what has been labeled the New Generation era. The easiest explanation here is just to say that people were getting tired of it. The gimmicks were wearing off, things had become repetitive, there weren't enough marketable wrestlers to maintain people's attention, but there were some more tangible things to point to as well, like the World Bodybuilding Federation that did not help the company. It was like an attempted bodybuilding spin-off of the WWF that was basically a flop and shut down after only 2 years. There were also multiple scandals involving the WWF emerging. Notably, in 1994, Vince McMahon was charged by the US Department of Justice, saying that he conspired to distribute steroids to WWF wrestlers, pretty much accusing him of giving his wrestlers drugs to make them stronger. Hulk Hogan testified that he had been taking steroids, but Vince never encouraged him to do it. He was facing years in prison, but was acquitted after an 18-day trial. You can imagine the kind of rumors and negative publicity that all of that caused. Maybe the biggest reason for their decline in the 1990s was new competition, mainly from WCW. I have an entire video talking about WCW if you want to hear more about it, but in short, they were a competing promotion that was investing a lot of money to try to draw viewers away from the WWF. They had an opposing show called Monday Nitro, airing directly against Monday Night Raw, and for well over a year, it was actually beating Raw in ratings. WCW was attracting key wrestlers away from the WWF, including Hulk Hogan, and things were looking bad. Now, I'm sure that any wrestling fan watching this is familiar with the Montreal Screwjob. It's quite a name, but in short, Bret Hart was one of those popular wrestlers making that transition over to WCW. So in his final WWF match, he unfairly lost the title to Shawn Michaels under secret orders from Vince McMahon. The ref was instructed to act like Hart had submitted even though he didn't, and that is considered to be a major turning point of the WWF. Kind of like the unofficial start of the next rise with the Attitude Era. In an effort to separate themselves from WCW, the WWF became wild. I'm talking about more violence and sexuality and I guess more attitude than ever before. Monday Night Raw was given a TV-14 rating because there was a lot of stuff happening on there that you may not want your little kid watching. They introduced their famous scratch logo. Mr. McMahon became a villainous wrestling personality that had this great feud going on with Stone Cold Steve Austin. There was some entertaining stuff happening, generally believed to be way more entertaining than the gimmicks over at WCW. Raw Raw had quickly pulled back ahead of Nitro, and in 2001, the WWF officially won the Monday Night Wars when they bought WCW. During that era, their revenue grew to about 5 times higher, their income became way more stable, the total attendance at their events more than doubled, and the number of people buying the pay-per-view events more than tripled. To this day, the Attitude Era is believed to be the best era in their existence, as reflected in this official poll conducted on their website. I don't want to talk too much about this time period because it's already probably the most talked about period of wrestling, and even though the Ruthless Aggression era is still fairly well liked, it did start with a less dramatic but still noticeable decline in their business. Overall popularity as far as attendance and pay-per-view orders went back down a bit, so even though things weren't terrible, I'm going to qualify this as their next fall. I have to bring it, but in 2001, they teamed up with NBC to start an Extreme Football League to compete with the NFL. It did not do well, there was too much wrestling involvement, it was dangerous, the skill level of the players was questionable, and people weren't too interested in watching it. It was shut down after that season due to poor ratings, and all the money that they lost from it is responsible for their dip in net income that they reported that year. But back to the wrestling end, despite WCW being gone, they were still losing some of their biggest stars. Arguably the biggest star of the Attitude Era was Stone Cold Steve Austin, and that's the bottom line. But in January of 2000, he missed a lot of time due to a seemingly overdue neck surgery. And then even when he came back, he turned heel, people didn't seem to like him as a bad guy, more issues followed, and things were never the same. The Rock was also one of the biggest stars of the previous era, and he was absent for a lot of 2001, so he can go and film a movie called The Scorpion King. It's worth mentioning that they changed their name going into this new era due to the initials overlapping with the World Wildlife Fund, though I have to say, they did promote the name change with some clever commercials. Also, it can be argued that there was just a certain magic captured in the previous era that just couldn't go on forever. It saved the company, it put them back on the map, and they simply fell back down a bit following that initial explosion. Alright, here's the controversial part of the video. Their next and final rise occurred with the PG era, and I know there are many wrestling fans here that will say that the WWE just continued going downhill from there. I mean, referring back to that poll, it seems crazy to suggest that there was a rise going into the PG era, which, by the way, it's not their definition, but for many, it still expands into the present, and that's how I'm going to be treating it. It's called the PG era because after almost a decade of violent craziness happening on Monday Night Raw, the WWE decided to scale it back and become more family-friendly. So the TV-14 rating that was given to the show during the Monday Night Wars was brought back down to PG, and even though many people have argued that the family-friendly approach makes for a less entertaining show, it actually benefits them quite a bit. It broadens their audience to include younger fans, who tend to be a big demographic for professional wrestling, and it makes them more advertiser-friendly. If people aren't showing covered in blood or whatever, it makes brands more willing to be associated with them. It's honestly hard to deny the financial impact that this has had, just about doubling their revenue since the rating was put into effect, and surpassing $1 billion for the first time ever in 2021. When we break down that $1 billion, some of it comes from live events and consumer products, but like 85% of it comes from media. And when we further break down those media figures, over 200 million of it comes from their network and pay-per-views. In 2014, they started the WWE Network as its own streaming service, and within a year, it had over 1 million subscribers, paying $10 a month. Doing some quick math, it tells me that they were already collecting over $120 million a year just from that, which, by the way, is more than their total yearly revenue from back when they were having trouble in the 1990s. In 2021, they made a deal with Peacock for them to have exclusive streaming rights of the network, so that deal, combined with the pay-per-views, is what makes up that $215 million. They do collect money from sponsors and other stuff, but more than half of all of their revenue comes from their TV shows. Licensing revenues from NBC and Fox for them to air Raw, SmackDown, and NXT, combining for 7 hours of original programming each week. So even though many fans don't agree with the family-friendly direction they have taken, and even argue that things have become too repetitive and pointless to justify so many hours of content, those are the exact things that have allowed them to gain a specific following that has led to these large multi-year contracts. We also have to remember that the WWE is a public company. In 1999, when they were in the middle of their comeback, they took advantage of it by having an initial public stock offering. So from that point, they have had investors that are concerned with financial results and oftentimes want to see them fast. When that's the case, it can be hard to take risks that may not pay off for a while, and it just makes sense to settle into something that's seemingly profitable and stable, and considering that they are currently more profitable than they have ever been before, I don't know if we can expect any major changes anytime soon. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about the WWE? Have you been a fan for a while? Have you experienced these different eras with the various ups and downs? Keep in mind, I did my best to keep the video more about the company itself and for a general audience by not going into too much detail and only by sticking to what I believe to be the biggest reasons behind these changes. Though I should mention that in 2022, 77-year-old Vince McMahon stepped down from being the company's chairman and CEO in the middle of more scandals. So that could potentially lead to more changes. There have been some rumors circulating. So what do you see for the future of the WWE, both financially and creatively? Does something need to change? Are they doing well the way things are? What do you think? Mixed martial arts is a comparatively new sport that blends techniques and elements from different types of fighting. I'm talking about karate and boxing and wrestling and all these others rolled into one to create this intense hybrid sport that has proven to be popular. The biggest and most notable MMA promotion in the world, by far the one where all the best fighters compete, is the Ultimate Fighting Championship. The UFC is easily among the biggest success stories in sports over the past few decades. Consider that in 2001 it was sold for a modest $2 million. Can you even imagine buying the UFC for $2 million? It was in bad shape, believed to be approaching bankruptcy with a terrible reputation, and in reality, a lot of people were saying that $2 million was paying way too much for it. Yeah, however, in 2016, when it was sold again, the new sale price was $4 billion, meaning it became 2,000 times more valuable over the course of 15 years. A return on investment that is almost unheard of, and to take it even a step further, in 2023, it merged with the WWE to create a combined company valued at over $21 billion. The UFC is transformed from a struggling gimmick into a legitimate multi-billion-dollar organization. It is an impressive story, so in this video, I want to talk about the rise, fall, and rise again of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. UFC 1, the first ever event, was held on November 12, 1993 as a pay-per-view event where fighters of different styles were invited to compete against each other in a single elimination tournament. The fights were held in a fenced-in octagon without corners, and the only rules were that you couldn't hit the other person in the groin, gouge their eyes, or bite them. Other than that, everything was allowed. In short, members of the Gracie family, known for pioneering Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, teamed up with an ad executive named Arthur Davey to create the concept. They found a bunch of investors, pitched the idea to Semaphore Entertainment Group, known for hosting pay-per-view events, and that is how it started. The whole idea of it was based on the theoretical questions of what would happen if people of different fighting backgrounds were to fight each other. It's like when you're hanging out with your friends and someone says, hey, who do you think would win in a fight, a wrestler or a boxer? And then you sit there for the next 10 minutes talking about how that fight would play out. Well, basically, that is how the UFC started. They figured people would be entertained and curious about these unusual matchups. That first event was bought by over 85,000 people, making it successful enough for them to keep doing it. By UFC 5, about a year and a half later, their numbers had tripled, and Semaphore Entertainment Group bought full ownership of the brand from the original creators. UFC was gaining popularity as this wild, no-holds-barred, anything-goes type of promotion, which, as you might expect, was new and exciting. However, there were a lot of issues forming that quickly caused a major decline in the business. I put together a list of factors behind it, but most of it stems from the fact that UFC seemed like it was so dangerous. There are two parts to this. For one, they really should have some degree of regulation, right? You can't just put two people together in a cage and allow them to do anything to each other. That's not safe. People were getting kicked in the face while they were on the ground. Teeth were flying across the room. Literally, there was a match at UFC 3 with a 400-pound weight difference between the opponents. The American Medical Association wanted it to be banned, so a very real safety concern in those early matches. And the other part of it was that UFC was embracing those safety concerns, making it seem even more dangerous than it actually was. Yeah, the UFC was wild in those early days, and that dangerous reputation that helped establish them in the first place quickly started to hurt them. In 1996, John McCain, a senator from Arizona, actively started fighting against it. After seeing a tape of one of the events, he called it barbaric, said it wasn't a sport, and used the phrase human cockfighting to describe it, which became a popular phrase among people protesting it. He had influence over the cable companies like Time Warner who decided to stop offering the pay-per-view events, meaning most people around the country could not buy a UFC fight even if they wanted to. He sent letters to all of the governors in the country asking them to ban UFC fighting in their state, which did end up happening in most of them. All of these factors caused their viewership to fall to about 5% of what it once was. To finish up my list here, UFC was viewed by the public as a gimmick, which honestly was a discouraging time for them because they were working to legitimize it, slowly adding more rules to the fights, like making gloves mandatory, setting time limits, weight classes. I don't want to get too specific, but UFC 20 did look a lot different from UFC 1. So by the late 1990s, there were all these talented fighters in the UFC evolving the sport of MMA as we know it, but most of the public still saw it as a big joke. I think this shows it perfectly. In 1998, Joe Rogan was on Conan O'Brien's talk show talking about the UFC, and I would say doing a good job in promoting it, but everyone just kept laughing at him.
You know, like the Ultimate Fighting Championship, you know, you got a referee, and if it gets out of hand, it's very safe. I mean, no one in all the...
People were clearly not taking it seriously, so by the 2000s, it was almost worthless and dangerously close to being shut down. So now, I'm going to start a new, much happier list for UFC fans that explains how they overcame these obstacles and transformed into the multi-billion-dollar, globally recognized success that they are today. For the first reason, I'm going to lump together all of the executives, mainly the Fertitta brothers and, of course, Dana White. Like I mentioned in the beginning, the UFC was sold in 2001 to the Fertitta brothers. Their family was involved in the Las Vegas casino business. Dana White was already managing UFC fighters. He had known Lorenzo Fertitta since they were kids, so he helped make that deal happen, received a minority stake in the company, and became the new president. It was under their control that UFC was able to grow, so keep in mind that they have been the main decision makers behind the rest of the reasons on my list. The next one being regulations. Clearly, these fights needed to be more regulated if they were going to be allowed to happen and allowed to be broadcast over television. So they really cracked down on it. In 2001, a unified set of rules for MMA was adopted by the New Jersey State Athletic Control Board, and in 2009, those rules were adopted by the Association of Boxing Commissions. Again, I don't want to get too specific here, but today, all of the UFC fights are legally sanctioned and regulated just like any other sport. New York was the final state to lift their ban in 2016, and everything has been legitimized. The changes were so effective that even John McCain himself expressed his approval of the UFC, and in a bit of a twist, Dana White has expressed his gratitude toward John McCain, saying, "I consider John McCain the guy who started UFC. If it wasn't for McCain, I wouldn't be here right now." So in the early 2000s, the UFC was successfully navigating through these legal issues, making their fights safer and more available, and even improving their reputation, but they were still struggling to attract an audience. By 2004, the numbers were still not looking good. The Fertitta brothers had invested nearly $40 million into the organization that was only pulling in about $14 million in sales per year. They were falling into debt, and the solution turned out to be the next reason on my list, the Ultimate Fighter TV show. I'm guessing that a lot of the viewers have seen this before. It's a popular show, but it's essentially a reality show where a bunch of fighters live in a house together and compete to win a UFC contract. And just listening to Dana White describe trying to get the show on the air, it almost seems like a miracle that it ever happened. They were rejected by all the networks except Spike TV, who also didn't seem to have all that much interest in the show. See, Spike was a new network, marketed to be the first network for men, so seemingly a perfect fit for the Ultimate Fighter, but they were showing more interest in this new crazy trampoline sport called slam ball, and only agreed to air the Ultimate Fighter if the USC paid to produce it. Well, as we now know, it turned out to be a big success, partially because it was on right after Monday Night Raw, but also because it featured some interesting coaches like Chuck Liddell and Randy Couture, and interesting contestants that viewers really grew to care about. The big Season 1 finale was their first non-pay-per-view live fight. It was between the finalists, and it did so well that I guess they agreed to make a second season directly after the fight in an alley behind the venue. And that was it. That was the spark for the big turnaround. The show and the finale exposed millions of people to the sport who had previously overlooked it or maybe didn't even know about it. it. Let me know if it's the case for you, but I remember this being the first time that I learned about UFC, and everything started exploding from there. Their revenue grew 12 times higher within 2 years, and everyone started talking about MMA in a much more respectful manner than before. My next reason behind their comeback is acquisitions, because right when they started gaining momentum, they were fast to capitalize on it by acquiring some of their most significant competitors. Notably, they bought World Fighting Alliance in 2006, Pride Fighting Championships the following year, that's a controversial one, and Strikeforce in 2011. Some of the advantages here is that these acquisitions reduce competition, help them gain more talent, and add to the backlog of previous fights in their library. It has gone so far that fighters have filed antitrust lawsuits against the UFC, claiming that their monopoly over MMA allows them to pay the fighters less money because there aren't any other organizations out there that can give competing offers. Leading me to my next reason behind the comeback, the fighters themselves. Obviously, so many talented fighters have been associated with the UFC over the years, but a few of them have really made their way into mainstream popularity and helped attract viewers to the fights. One that stands out, of course, would be Conor McGregor. I mean, he has been involved in some of the best-selling UFC events, including UFC 229, the best-selling one of all time, with 2.4 million people buying it on pay-per-view. Another obvious fighter would be Ronda Rousey, signing with the UFC as their first female fighter in 2013, and whether you like it or not, she briefly became one of the most famous athletes in the world. Unlike the 1990s, the UFC now has a reputation of having some of the best fighters in the world, many of which have big personalities that are entertaining to watch. Finally, to finish the list, the UFC has been heavily promoted in just about every way imaginable. In 2011, they signed a 7-year deal with Fox Sports to air the fights on their network and the Ultimate Fighter show on FX. Then, in 2018, they made a 5-year deal with ESPN. That's impressive. In the 1990s, cable companies refused to air the fights, even on pay-per-view, and now they are signing billion-dollar deals with these big cable channels. Aside from that, Electronic Arts publishes a popular UFC video game. There are more than 100 UFC gyms around the world. Joe Rogan continues to bring attention to it through his popular podcast, not to mention everything Dana White has been doing to personally promote it. So yeah, they have been getting the word out about UFC. It has fully transformed from an obscure underground organization into what I think we can call a global phenomenon. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about the UFC and how they were able to transform their business? Keep in mind that this is a wide subject, one of the biggest stories in sports over the past few decades that could easily be talked about for hours. Plenty of things that could be criticized, but also a lot to respect. So in this video, I did my best to stick to the aspects that involve their rise, fall, and rise again to give a general overview of their 30+ year history.